Hello and welcome to another episode of In the Crosshairs, where we take an objective look at games both old and new to see how they really hold up. And speaking of old and new games, for today's review we're going to be taking a look at a game that was a big part of my childhood for the longest time, Spyro the Dragon. That's right, we're going to be taking a look at the first game in the Reignited trilogy to see how Spyro handled the shift into the modern era. I'll also make some comparisons between the original and the Reignited remake for some context. With that said, let's fly right in. This is Spyro the Dragon Reignited. Naturally, it's going to be impossible to talk about the Reignited remake without talking about the original Spyro on PS1. The original Spyro was released in 1998 and it was developed by Insomniac Games. Spyro the Dragon is a collectathon platformer with a bit of action-adventure on the side. The Reignited version was developed by Toys for Bob and published by Activision rather than Sony. The remake features a largely updated version of the original game, with infinitely better graphics and bug fixes. This remake is very similar to how the Crash Bandicoot Insane trilogy was a graphical remake to the original Crash Bandicoot games. And speaking of Crash Bandicoot, my first experience with the original Spyro the Dragon was through a code that could be inputted on the title screen of Crash Bandicoot Warped. This code gave the player access to the demo version of Spyro, which looking back was a really clever way to introduce Crash players to a new game, even if players happened to input the code by accident. Spyro the Dragon on the PS1 was part of my original trilogy of games, along with Crash Bandicoot and Sonic the Hedgehog, with Mario being the royal vizier scheming in the background. Spyro was among the first games I ever went out of my way to 100% complete, so I'm not just looking back on nostalgia, I'm diving directly back into my childhood for this, and needless to say, I'm stoked to be looking at it today. Among stories, Spyro's story is as comically simple as it gets. The game begins with a live interview with some dragons within one of the 5 main worlds. While this interview goes on, we can see Spyro himself screwing off in the background as the dragons answer questions about the main antagonist, Gnasty Gnorc. Gnasty Gnorc happens to be watching the interview from his own homeworld and after being insulted repeatedly decides to turn all the dragons to crystals. Now, I'm not sure if the dragons in the Artisan world got the memo, but if someone can hit you with spells from worlds away, that still counts as a threat that's equivalent to having a laser-guided nuke. Spyro was the only one to escape the assault due to his small size, and now it's up to him to free the dragons, find the missing gems, and reclaim all of the stolen dragon eggs. After that's done, it's time to turn Gnasty Gnorc into barbecue and then steal his shit. Gotta love that sweet cartoon violence. When starting off, Spyro's primary forms of attack is a simple charge and a fire breath. He can also perform a side roll to the left or right to avoid attacks. And the only reason you're not seeing a demonstration on screen right now is because I completely forgot that he could do it. It's not like it's very useful though, as Spyro can easily jump to avoid attacks too. Being a dragon, Spyro also has the ability to glide after a jump, which is necessary to explore the worlds throughout the dragon realms. Each realm contains a hub world, 3 sub-worlds, a flight range, and a boss world. The 5 worlds in each realm contain dragons to rescue, loot to collect, and enemies to kill. The flight ranges on the other hand are a time attack that I will be bitching about very shortly, trust me. Most of the dragons you rescue offer some sort of advice to help you as you play, like how to take on certain baddies. Some enemies can be both charged and flamed, but some are either too big to be charged or wear heat-proof armor. You really have to choose the right attack for the situation. You may even find some enemies that can't be killed by normal means. Simple fix. Either find a speed booster or a fairy that can enhance your flame breath, and then go to town. Defeated enemies will drop gems for you to collect, and if it's an enemy that you've already defeated, it'll drop an orb that will give you an extra life if you collect enough of them. They can be found just about everywhere, from inside chests to around innocuous corners, and all the way in areas that you would not ever have considered checking. Basically, you're going through every place you visit with a fine-tooth comb. Lastly, there are the eggs. And these fuckers. Egg thieves. Ever have that gaming sound that has stuck with you since you were a kid? Like the Re-Deads from Ocarina of Time or Snake from Metal Gear being discovered? Well, the Egg Thief is one such enemy that has such a distinct sound cue with him that to this day I still call these bastards the na-na-na-na-na guys. These little shits will rocket off with the dragon eggs in hand and it's up to Spyro to charge after them. Sometimes you'll get lucky with either a good charge or a flame at just the right time, but other times you'll be chasing these fuckers in circles. I think I have a new speedy bastard to retroactively add to one of my countdowns. Now let's talk about Sparks real quick. He's the golden dragonfly that accompanies Spyro on his journey. He's pretty handy as he collects nearby gems and serves as Spyro's health meter. Sparks' color will change every time Spyro is hit until he eventually disappears. Recovering both Sparks and the hit points is easy. Just kill a random fodder roaming the field, like a sheep or a sentient mushroom, and Sparks will be back in no time at all. Finally, I have to address the purple dragon in the room, or rather the black dragon, because some of you may be wondering what the hell happened to Spyro in this footage. If you've been into games from either the 5th generation of gaming consoles or earlier, you would be well aware that games in that era loved adding in cheat codes. Yes, there are still cheat codes today, but they were way more prevalent back before 2005. Back then, cheat codes were usually discovered by word of mouth or via gaming magazines. Spyro was one such game that had cheat codes, and when I found out from the official Spyro Twitter page that there were cheat codes in the Reignited trilogy, I nearly lost my damn mind. It also makes me realize just how old I really am. Well, shit. Now that I've taken an amazing trip down memory lane, it's time for me to once again trash talk the game. I mentioned earlier that the Reignited trilogy was a graphical and technical update of the original Spyro, and that is precisely what it is. Some people may fail to realize that the original Spyro's graphics wasn't the core problem, it was the elements in the gameplay. Let's start with one of the main problems, the gem collecting. Some of the gem placements are just god awful. There are areas that you literally can't see or have to trust on blind faith to get to, and these areas have gems you need to collect. If it's not in a place you would never consider checking, then it's a random gem that's in the middle of nowhere because it looks like either nothing was there or Sparks failed to pick it up. And backtracking to find that one gem or two you missed is mind-numbingly frustrating. Granted, the gems shine in the distance to let you know something is there, but the placement of these gems could have been updated so we're not trying to fly into things while hoping to get to a secret area. And that gets me to the level design. Most levels are pretty well designed, but there are a few that can just go to hell. Treetops is by far the best example of this, as you have the choice to initially take 2 routes, but you have to backtrack up the treetops to choose a new route, which will bog down the pace in a otherwise fast-paced level, ironically. Yet the most irritating thing about this level is getting the 100%, which requires using multiple boost ramps and making jumps you very likely wouldn't have guessed unless you looked up a guide. Then there are the flight ranges in each world. They suck. The premise of these worlds is to have Spyro fly and tag landmarks and enemies while on a timer. This sounds good in concept until you realize exactly how tight that timer is. It's made a lot more difficult if you don't know where everything is at or how it behaves, or it's that one thing you missed that you don't have enough time to go back to. People that are new to Spyro will quickly figure out just how absurd these levels are, because it's almost impossible for a new player to beat these in one go. The flight range levels could just have easily been scrapped in the remake in favor of new, unique levels, but I digress. And naturally we have to touch base on the enemies. For the most part, the enemies themselves are not a big issue, but the bosses are another story. They are a complete joke, with the only funny one being Toasty. Most of them take 3 hits to defeat, and none of them put up a challenge, not even Nasty Nork, and he goes down in 2 hits. The ironic thing about all of these problems is that a remake is supposed to improve upon the original concept, not just update it. An example of a good remake is Pokemon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. Game Freak got the original Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald, updated the look, then added the gameplay features seen in the 6th Pokemon generation, and then expanded the game in both playtime and story. The Reignited remake, which is beautiful and amazing to look at, is not a good remake. In fact, it's terrible as a remake. Not even all the bugs in the original game were fixed. The Reignited remake only fixed very specific bugs and oversights. Some of the more troublesome problems, like Spyro being right next to a gem and not picking it up, or Spyro hitting invisible walls that shouldn't be there, or the simple problem with gliding to a platform with precise timing should have been something the remake actively chose to fix. Because of this, the Reignited trilogy feels like more of a cash grab. An important thing to note is that even though Spyro has problems that the remake hasn't bothered fixing, it's also a really fun game. The overall pace is solid, and moreover, the complaints that I have for the game are mainly if you want to do 100% completion. There's nothing in Spyro the Dragon that would be considered a game-breaking problem. Well, for a casual player, anyway. If you never played a Spyro game before, getting the Reignited trilogy is a good place to start, especially since 3 games in 1 for $40 is a pretty sweet deal. If you still have your original version of Spyro the Dragon, you may want to stick with that, as the Reignited trilogy doesn't offer anything you haven't seen before other than a visual update. Thank you for joining me once again for another review. It's always nice to take a look at a game that I haven't played since I was a kid, and playing Spyro again was a trip. With that said, I'm still taking requests for both reviews and countdowns, so if you have a topic you want me to look at, just leave a comment down below. I'm currently brewing up the next countdown, but I'm having a little bit of writer's block, so I may need to start drinking while scripting again. I seem to write a lot better when I'm hammered. But until then, this has been Regnilla, and I will see you again in the next video. Take care, people.